My name is Alyssa. Back then, I was 24 years old and had recently relocated to a quiet town about an hour north of the city to be closer to my family. While my parents still lived downtown, I wasn't keen on city life anymore. So I opted for something smaller, more peaceful. I didn't know much about the town beforehand, but the rent was surprisingly affordable, and my parents assured me it was a decent area. Before the move, my work history was scattered-eyed, jumped between jobs, never really finding the right fit. Once I settled into my new apartment, I started job hunting almost immediately. My savings were running low, so I couldn't afford to be choosy. One of the first listings I came across was for a local grocery store I'd never heard of. It didn't seem to be part of a chain, more like a family-run place. I had worked at a grocery store during high school, so I figured my past experience might help. I applied and, surprisingly, got a phone call just a few hours later. The caller was a man named Frank. He asked me a few general questions, nothing too in-depth, and then told me I was hired. No interview, no follow-up, just you're in. I found Frank's tone on the phone a bit unsettling. I couldn't quite explain why. Something about his way of speaking or his pacing just felt off. Still, the job offer was better than nothing. There was one catch though. The position was for overnight stock shifts. I had never worked nights before and didn't know how I'd handle it, but again, I didn't have many options. 3 days later, I had everything ready: paperwork, ID, the usual. I left my apartment around 9:30 p.m. The store closed at 9, so when I pulled into the lot, it was empty and dark. Only a few dim lights lit up the front. As I walked up, I saw Frank already standing by the front doors, waiting. He opened them and greeted me with a stiff nod. Frank was a large man, probably around 6'2", broad-shouldered and rugged-looking with a shaved head and thick, patchy beard. He led me through the dark, quiet store to a small office at the back, where we could handle paperwork. As we walked, I noticed the store was off. The aisles were dirty, the lighting was poor, and it had a stale, sour smell, nothing like the average grocery store I was used to. I chalked it up to small-town standards, and kept my thoughts to myself. In the office, Frank looked over my documents while making small talk. It started out innocent, asking how I liked the new town, if I was settling in okay. But then his questions turned a little strange. He asked if I lived alone, if anyone drove me to work, and if someone was expecting me later. I answered vaguely, just to avoid being rude, but it sent up red flags. The whole time he wore this forced, wide grin that didn't suit him at all. It felt plastered on, unnatural. After I dropped off my bag and coat in the office, he took me to an aisle stacked with boxes and carts. He explained how to stock the shelves, then left me to it. The work was straightforward, and I tried to focus on it. But after about an hour, I began to feel uneasy. I noticed I was completely alone with Frank. No other staff, no sounds besides the hum of the fridge units and my own movement. Then I noticed him watching me. At first I thought I imagined it, but then I caught him peeking around corners, just standing there, silently staring. He wouldn't say anything, just walk away. Quickly, when I spotted him, at first I thought maybe he was checking on me since it was my first shift, but the way he lingered, the way he stared, it didn't feel like that. Something was very wrong. I started debating whether I should even return for another shift. But for now, I just needed to get through this one. I stayed alert, kept an eye over my shoulder. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I looked up and saw Frank again, this time, standing directly at the end of the aisle. When our eyes met, he began walking toward me with that same creepy smile. "How about we take our 15-minute break?" he asked in a cheery tone that didn't match his expression. I hesitated, but agreed. I hadn't realized we'd be taking breaks. Together, he led me to the back of the store, through a heavy steel door that opened into the delivery area. A single car was parked nearby. As we stepped outside, the car turned on and slowly pulled away. Frank lit a cigarette and leaned against the wall, watching it drive off without saying a word. I didn't know what to do. I had brought a sandwich, and was hoping to eat alone somewhere inside, but now I was stuck in this awkward silence. I stood beside him, trying to act casual, but his silence and the way he stared at me made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the same car that had driven off returned. It slowed and pulled right up to us, but didn't go past. I glanced at Frank to see his reaction. He didn't even acknowledge the car. Instead, he kept his cold, unsettling stare locked on me, like he didn't even notice the vehicle. That's when it hit me, something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Before the car fully stopped, I turned and bolted back through the steel door, racing down the hallway toward the office. My bag, my wallet, my coat. I had to grab everything and get out. But when I got there, Everything was gone. The coat rack was empty. The desk cleared. It was like I'd never been there. Then I heard footsteps. More than one set. Someone was coming. Without thinking, I ran to the front of the store, burst out the main doors, and sprinted down the road. The only place open nearby was a gas station I remembered seeing on the way. I ran straight there and begged the clerk to call the police. At first, a part of me thought maybe I'd just overreacted. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. But when the police arrived and went to question Frank, things only got stranger. They found my bag and belongings right there, in the office where I'd left them, everything back in place. Frank denied that any car had approached us or that anything unusual had happened. When officers requested to review security footage, they found that every camera had footage except for the one at the back door. That one, conveniently, hadn't been recording. There wasn't enough evidence for anything concrete, so the case went nowhere. I left the town the very next day, broke my lease, packed up and moved back in with my parents until I could figure out my next step. To this day, I don't know what was going to happen that night, but the way Frank tried to erase my presence, the eerie calmness, the timing of that current, all tells me I narrowly escaped something far worse, and I'll never forget that feeling of knowing something evil was just around the corner. This happened back in late 2021. I was trying to earn some side income, and decided to sign up for a food delivery service. I got approved quickly, the account was good to go, but I didn't actually start using it for nearly a month. I kept delaying it, always telling myself I'd do it tomorrow. Then one night, after coming home from work, I was bored and too awake to sleep, so I figured I might as well give it a shot. My first few deliveries went fine. I was learning how the app worked, and felt like I was getting into a rhythm. After about 3 hours, just after midnight, I received an order that was completely different from the others. The listed tip was huge, around $45, almost as much as I had made the whole evening. Without thinking twice, I accepted it. The pickup was from a fast food restaurant that stayed open 24/7. It was the only one in our small town that did. The place sat near the edge of a long highway that stretched out into empty farmland. Once I grabbed the food, I saw that the delivery address led deep into the countryside, farther than I'd expected. Not long after I left the restaurant, I got a call from the customer. He sounded older, probably in his 30s, and had a harsh, irritated tone. He asked me to confirm the delivery address. I read it straight from the app, and after a brief pause, he just hung up without saying anything else. That immediately struck me as strange. Someone willing to tip that much usually isn't so cold or rude. Maybe he was just impatient and wanted the food quickly, but even then, something didn't feel right. Still, I kept driving. The road stretched far from town, surrounded by fog and wide open land. There were small homes scattered off to the sides, but mostly it was empty. As I drove, that uneasy feeling got stronger. It could have been the fog, the quiet, or just the strange phone call earlier, but something was definitely off. Eventually, I turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt path. The fog was thick, and all I could see around me were tall grass and endless darkness. I moved slowly until a house finally came into view. It looked old, wooden, with a large porch and a worn-down exterior like something out of an abandoned farm. There were lights on inside, and the address matched what was in the app. I parked and stepped out, food in hand, walking slowly toward the porch. The silence was suffocating. No crickets, no wind, nothing but the sound of my own footsteps. Even the house was silent from the outside. I didn't hear any movement or voices inside. As I raised my hand to knock, the door creaked open on its own. Before I could say anything, I heard a voice call from deeper inside the house. It was the same man from the phone. He asked if I was the delivery guy. I said yes, and told him I'd just leave the order on the porch. But he asked me to bring it inside and set it on the kitchen counter. His voice still had that irritated, heavy tone, like he was annoyed with me for no reason. I stepped in cautiously. The air inside smelled stale and moldy, like the house hadn't been aired out or cleaned in years. The floor creaked under my feet, and then suddenly, music started playing. It was an old, eerie piano tune coming from the back of the house, loud and jarring. It made the entire place feel more unsettling. I called out to him, but he didn't answer. That was when it hit me. This was not normal. I kept walking, but slowed down as I noticed how dark the hallway was getting. The kitchen and the rooms nearby were barely lit. The room I assumed he was in, completely dark. I stopped in my tracks. Something deep inside me screamed to get out. I dropped the bag of food on the floor and turned around, heading straight for the door, but right before I could reach it, I froze. The man was standing in the shadows, just a few feet from the door, staring at me. He hadn't said a word. His wide eyes locked onto mine, and the whites of his eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. It was like I had caught him off guard, like he wasn't expecting me to turn around so soon. That one moment stretched forever, and though I didn't get a clear look, I swear there was something in his hands. I didn't want to know what it was. I turned and ran, bolted out the door, sprinted to my car, and tore down the road without looking back. The fog swallowed everything behind me. Looking back, I'm convinced that man was planning something. He must have been sneaking up to the door, waiting for me to be far enough inside so he could shut and lock it behind me. The music, probably to drown out the sound of his footsteps. I never delivered food again after that night. I may have made some dumb decisions in life, but I know I didn't deserve whatever was waiting for me inside that house. If I had hesitated even a few seconds longer, I might not have made it out at all. Back in late 2019, I was 31 years old, living alone in a quiet town after being let go from the only stable job I'd ever had. That position was the reason I moved here to begin with, so when it ended, it left me stranded financially and emotionally. I didn't know what to do next while I tried to figure things out. I decided to take the first job I could find to keep myself going. A couple of weeks later, I got hired at a small roadside inn tucked along a remote stretch of highway, about 40 minutes from town. I was trained for a few days, but what I'm about to share took place during my first solo night shift, the very first time. I was left in charge on my own. This place was out in the middle of nowhere. There were no other active businesses nearby, just an old diner next door that had been abandoned years ago, its windows boarded and signs sun-bleached beyond recognition. The night began slow. A handful of guests arrived, and I checked them into their rooms without issue. Most of them looked exhausted, just passing through, but one woman stood out. She appeared uneasy, not just tired but jumpy, constantly looking over her shoulder, speaking fast, rushing the check-in process. She barely made eye contact before grabbing her room key and disappearing down the hall. Then it went quiet for a long time. I sat behind the front desk, staring out through the glass doors at the empty highway. Hardly a car passed. I figured the rest of the night would be just as uneventful, until a man walked in. He startled me not because of how he looked, but because I never heard a vehicle. No headlights, no engine, nothing. It was like he'd just appeared. I assumed he must have already been staying there and needed help with something, but he quickly made it clear that he hadn't checked in. He walked up and asked if there were any rooms available and how much they cost. "We've got a few left," I told him. "Do you want to get a room for the night?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, his eyes shifted, glancing behind me, focused on something over my shoulder. After a few seconds, he said quietly, "No thanks," and walked right back out the front door. I turned around, trying to figure out what had grabbed his attention. The only thing behind me was what I referred to as the key rack, a wooden wall, filled with little compartments, each holding an old-fashioned metal room key. This place didn't have any digital locks or swipe cards. Everything was analog and outdated. I kept watching the door after he left, expecting to see headlights or a car pulling out of the lot, but nothing moved. No car ever left. That made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was no way that man had just wandered in on foot. The closest gas station was easily 12 miles away, and this area didn't even have sidewalks, especially not along the highway. Yet he came and left without a trace. I stepped outside and looked around. The parking lot was dead quiet. Just the same 3 cars that had been there earlier. No sign of the man at all. I went back inside and tried to shake it off. Time crawled by. The owner had told me not to worry about doing much on my first solo shift except check-ins, so I just sat at the desk with my thoughts. Then, nearly an hour later, the desk phone rang sharply, cutting through the silence. It was a call from one of the guest rooms. A woman's voice, shaky and panicked, told me someone had been standing outside her door and wouldn't leave. I jumped up and rushed outside. The parking lot still looked deserted. I made my way to her room at the far end of the building. By the time I got there, whoever had been outside was already gone. She opened the door slowly, visibly rattled. I asked her if she recognized the man or if he had spoken to her. She shook her head, said he never said a word. He just stood there, outside her window, motionless. She asked him to go away. He didn't move, so she called me. When she described what he looked like, I felt cold. It was him, the same man from earlier. Same build, same lifeless stare. I asked her if she wanted me to call the police, but she practically begged me not to, said she was leaving in the morning and didn't want to make it a whole thing. She just asked that if I saw him again, I tell him to go. I agreed, but the whole thing felt wrong. I went back to the front desk and kept thinking about it. Why was that man there in the first place? What did he want? Why was he watching her room? He hadn't seemed drunk or high when he walked in. He was calm, calculated. Around 3 a.m., everything changed. I heard what sounded like furniture being knocked over, thuds, scraping, and loud bangs that echoed through the walls. I bolted toward the noise. It was coming from the far end of the motel, her room. The door was wide open. Inside, I saw the woman backed into a corner, trembling. The man was in front of her, blocking her exit. His body language was aggressive. I shouted at him without even thinking. He turned and looked at me, his face twisted with fury, eyes bloodshot and wild. He rushed toward me, but instead of attacking, he ran straight past, tore through the parking lot, and vanished into the forest beyond the highway. I hurried to the woman, who was still frozen in fear. She hadn't been harmed, but she was clearly traumatized. I finally called the police. When they arrived and I explained everything, the full story came out. She confessed that she knew the man. He was her ex-husband, volatile and abusive man she'd been trying to escape. She'd checked into the hotel to hide, hoping to avoid being found. When I asked earlier if she wanted help, she lied, thinking he might just leave if she didn't react. But while I had been checking on her the first time, he had gone around to the front desk and stolen a spare room key from the rack. That's what he'd been eyeing when he came in. He planned this. That night still bothers me, not just because of what happened, but because of how close things came to being much worse. If I'd ignored the phone, if I hadn't arrived in time, if he had locked the door behind him, who knows what might have happened. I'd stayed at that job for another few months, but the atmosphere changed after that. The quiet nights weren't peaceful anymore. They were tense, suspicious, and filled with uneasy guests and long shadows. Eventually, I quit, but I still remember his eyes and how easily someone can just appear